Welcome to the Jung Anthology Podcast, analytical psychology seminars from the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. A new model of psychological types with John Beebe, M.D. This episode is part one of the series, A New Model of Psychological Types. Jung's theory of psychological types is an attempt to make comprehensible the regular differences between individuals. His concepts of introversion and extraversion, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition have gained wide currency since their introduction in 1920. However, applying these concepts to practical situations is often confusing. Dr. Beebe's new model of typology shows how the 8 types relate to complexes that can be recognized in dreams and styles of behavior. The model, which permits the types to be recognized more easily and with more precision, is illustrated with examples drawn from clinical work and works of creative imagination. It was recorded in 1988. John Beebe, M.D., a physician specializing in psychotherapy, is a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and a past president of the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco. He is the author of Integrity in Depth, editor of C.G. Jung's Aspects of the Masculine, and co-author of The Presence of the Feminine in Film. He is the founding editor of the San Francisco Institute Library Journal, now titled Jung Journal, Culture and Psyche, and was the first American co-editor of the London-based Journal of Analytical Psychology. An international lecturer, he is widely known for his work on psychological types, the psychology of moral processes, and the Jungian understanding of film. Recently, he has been engaged in training the first generation of analytical psychologists in China. And we'll have links in the show notes to the complete series, as well as to other seminars by John Beebe. And now here's the lecture.
These days, we think we know so much about types because it's become a big business. Last March, a year ago March, in Fortune magazine, there was an article that personality tests are back. And the personality test they meant was the Myers-Briggs type inventory. They said that last year 1.5 million people took the Myers-Briggs type inventory. And that this is now the most widely used personality test in America. And of course, when America gets around to something, it does it in a big way. It either doesn't do it at all or it goes all out. And so nowadays you don't have to tell people that there are thinking types and feeling types and intuitive types and sensation types. It's on the back of cereal boxes. And so I'm not going to exactly reinvent the wheel for you, although along the way I may take it off a few times and show you the spokes more than once so that we can get back to what the basic elements and units are. But what I want today is to get us beyond glibness and a kind of quick superficiality with the types and get us to rethink the whole thing before we lose it to the collective, and that we lose it to a very superficial, ego-based, will-oriented, and adaptation-centered point of view, and recover what I hope is the true Jungian spirit of type, which is that it is at the core of the problem of individuation. And this, of course, is the way Jung himself reached the type theory. I would even say reached for the type theory in the midst of the darkest and most perplexing time in his life. It isn't that he hadn't had hints when he was still the very ambitious young clergyman's son, turned physician, had married the wealthy Emma, had connected himself to prestigious doctors like Bleuler and Janet and eventually Freud, and was garnering an international reputation for himself as a lecturer, a physician, and a white-coated researcher, and was looking for ways to extend his influence and his reputation very much as a young psychiatrist at Michael Reese Hospital might do today with some kind of psychoimmunological research. In those days, Jung's claim to fame was the work he was doing with the word association test. And you know that in those days, association psychology was the psychology of the day. And introspectionism was at its heyday. This was the last gasp of a certain kind of early 20th century, late 19th century attempt to make phenomenological research a kind of basis for psychology before the game was entirely lost to behaviorism. And the thought was that by asking people to report on the thoughts passing through their mind, it would be possible to map out the associations of the human mind. So people were asked to focus on various feeling states and various idea states, and particularly word association was thought to be important. Perhaps one could map the linkages between words by getting the spontaneous associations to a list of stimulus words. The only problem was that occasionally people stalled or lapsed or couldn't think of a word or got lost or stayed with the last word and kept thinking about it and had various kinds of interfering responses. And the first researchers simply threw those out. They were some kind of static that was interfering with the test. But Jung, right at the beginning, decided to focus on the aberrant responses, focus on the static, on the places that didn't fit, and developed the idea that the interfering forces were feeling-toned complexes. And that by checking the different words on which there were stalled responses or perseverated responses or extremely peculiar responses to the 100 words in the word association test of Wundt, that he could map out the likely complexes that were affecting a given individual. So this was the beginning of complex psychology, and indeed for a long time Jung called his work complex psychology, and it attracted, as you know, the interest of Freud, because this gave some kind of empirical proof for the theory of repression. And under the influence of complex theory, Freud went so far as to speak of the Oedipus problem as the Oedipus complex. And although later, after Jung and Freud split, Freud banned the term complex as not intrinsic to psychoanalysis, it still lives a kind of shadow life even among psychoanalysts. And of course, for us Jungians, it's the cornerstone, or it's the centerpiece of the theory. But it was still a way of working that enabled Jung to be somehow outside the process. And he was looking at people very much as a scientific observer on the model of 19th century science. And he was some kind of psychological, pathological anatomist, very much like the German pathologist Virchow, who discovered all kinds of things about cirrhosis of the liver and by dissecting the liver. Jung really imagined that he could dissect the psyche in a rather cool way, and if you read those early psychoanalytic papers, like the one on number symbolism, you see a very brilliant young man appraising the psyche from outside, not yet touched by the experience himself, even though some of his own associations are used in the book on word association, and some of those of Sabina Spielrein and so forth, and one actually can see protocols that tell us quite a lot about what his complexes were with regard to her and so forth. Nevertheless, even with regard to his own psyche, he was still looking at it from outside, very much as Freud had looked at his own psyche from outside, because one can take a kind of detached exterior perspective to oneself, just as one can to other people's material. Well, then, what happened to everyone who's ever touched the unconscious. There comes a point when this all breaks down, and you realize that you are the thing you're studying, and so to speak, the snake bites you, and you can no longer simply detail the lovely colorings on the back of its skin and figure out its patterns from outside, and you fall into the soup in a big and bad way. And of course, this exactly is what happened to Jung, because he and Freud sort of together discovered transference and countertransference and the enormous confusion and complexity that comes up when two psychological individuals of extremely different temperaments try to interact with each other in depth. And they got into, as you know, a magically charged and extremely hostile and difficult relationship in which both men, despite their greatness and despite their psychological acumen and despite their practices and their work with patients and so forth, behaved, I think, extremely badly. And that story is all well told in the Freud-Jung correspondence. And at a critical moment in their dialogue, Freud corrected a slip of the pen of Jung's. And Jung flew off the handle in an extraordinary letter written December 18th of 1912, in which he basically tells Freud, I'm going to tell you exactly what I think of you. I'm not going to write simply another professional letter. I'm going to write a personal letter to help you. And I'm going to point out, and in effect he gave an Eric Bernian analysis of the game Sigmund Freud was playing. He says, you take it upon yourself to point out the faults in all of your students' eyes, and in the hope of correcting their neuroses. But as long as you are so busy doing this, it has a counterproductive effect, because all of us immediately realize that we couldn't possibly have any neurosis, because you are the most neurotic person of all of us if you have to do this all the time. And so from now on, I'm going to help you by pointing this out to you whenever you do this. Well, that worked. Freud wrote back, "Spare me your personal communications." And Jung wrote back, "Well, I never thrust my friendship on anyone, the rest is silence." And within a year, he was out of the psychoanalytic movement. Now, a year to the day after sending that letter, Jung had a famous dream, which you can read in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. I love to go back over this material. I think that's an extraordinary book, and one can't read it too many times. I just found myself looking at it again and just seeing how much that book fills your fantasy and how it becomes part of you. So I'm never sure when I tell this how much I elaborate it or change it in some way. But Jung had a dream, and this comes at that peculiar time, when he's having images of all of Europe being covered with blood, and he's beginning to feel that he ought to be getting down into the unconscious himself, and he's already had one of the very first experiences of active imagination, in which he imagines the ground literally giving way under his feet and going down into some sticky slime, and going into a cave and looking around, and first in pitch blackness, and finally tries to get out of there, and then just lots of blood pours out of the cave. And in that cave there has been a blonde man lying dead with a wound on his head, some kind of dead hero figure. But instead of rebirth, as he had expected, what pours out of the cave is blood. So that was fresh in his mind. That experience was just 6 days old when he had not an active imagination, but a night dream. And this dream is, as I said, dreamed a year to the day after sending the letter to Freud, in which he and a primitive brown-skinned man with a kind of fierce or mean aspect to him lie in wait for Siegfried, who must be killed. And just at a certain point, having heard Siegfried's horn, then Siegfried comes over the mountain pass, and at a particular point, they shoot him dead. Then for Jung, there's a tremendous feeling of disgust and remorse at having killed so beautiful a man. Then a rainstorm comes, and Jung is very afraid he's going to be caught, but the rain is going to wipe away all traces of the dead, and that's going to save Jung from being caught. But there's going to be, for him, an unbearable feeling of guilt to remain for a long time. Well, this is a dream that our Freudian colleagues, the psychoanalysts, have made a lot of, because they've also looked over our shoulders at this material. And of course, for them, Siegfried is nothing but a simply disguised Siegfried. And given the anniversary, it seems quite clear to them that Freud was absolutely right, that Jung did have a death wish toward him. And this is how Jung handled the guilt at breaking off the all-important relationship to Freud, and the price that Jung paid for the rupture of an object relation was a veiled psychotic episode. That's pretty much the way they play this. For me, as a Jungian analyst with faith in the just so quality of the unconscious, I prefer to use some amplification and go back into the myth that the dream itself brings up and point out that in the myth, Siegfried is the son of Sigismund. Sigismund was Freud's original name, and then it was shortened to Sigmund. So that what I think Jung was killing was his sonship to Freud, the divine crown prince hero of the psychoanalytic movement. It was that heroic role within Freud's psyche and within the psychoanalytic movement that I think Jung had to kill off. And that the death wish that Freud felt with his acute feeling function, Freud had a remarkable introverted feeling, was rather to the identification with this son role, which was too restrictive, too wrong for the person Jung was going to be. And so he simply broke the identification that he had made with the first really compellingly interesting and briefly satisfactory father that he'd ever had, because his own father was an extreme disappointment to him. In our modern language of self-psychology from Heinz Kohut, we would say that there was an enormous injury to Jung's idealized parental imago by having Paul Jung for a father. Paul Jung was a man who was not very successful in his own career and didn't have a great deal of integrity. He had lost his faith in Christianity and continued to work as a minister anyway, as if nothing had happened, and then died at an early age. And this was absolutely unbearable for Jung. And of course, in Freud, he found a man who was quite opposite. Freud never lost his faith in his own theory, which in fact became a kind of dogma for him. It became a kind of love object, almost an anima object, to which his theory, in a sense, was his anima, so that he actually had his colleagues swear loyalty to it, as medieval knights would have to swear fealty to a lady and promise never to betray it in any way, which of course was completely against the spirit of science. But at least Freud was a man who stood by what he believed in, and was a man of sufficient stature to repair a certain amount of that tremendous wound Jung had in his inability to idealize someone. Although, of course, there were times when Freud was extremely disappointed in, Jung was extremely disappointed in Freud. So breaking the identification with Freud left Jung really without a rudder. I don't know if any of you have ever broken an identification with someone, where you've allowed someone to pretty much organize your psychological experience for you in lieu of being yourself, yes, but nevertheless, that identification became your way through life. And then something in you can't stand having that in place. Some deeper part of the self demands that you get that person out of the center of your psyche and get about the business of being yourself. And I think if any of you have ever done that, you know what a profoundly upsetting experience it really is. Because you have not only the guilt at biting the hand that fed you, but you also have lost your dominant personality organization. In other words, you simply don't know who you are. And this was precisely the situation Jung felt himself to be in. And interestingly, it was not far off the situation that Europe was in around 1912 when the great peace that had lasted almost 100 years, at least for the main, although of course, as always in the history of the human race, there's always some war somewhere. Nevertheless, in terms of great world problems, the peace after the defeat of Napoleon had lasted for nearly 100 years, and a kind of civilization had grown up all through the 19th century as a consequence of that broke down massively around 1912 and 1913, so that the world that had been simply vanished after 1914. And so many people call 1912 the beginning of the 20th century. There are all kinds of evidences of that in painting and in music and in politics, that something was beginning to break down. And so the outer world was breaking down for Jung just at the same time his inner world was breaking down. And so he was very much alive to the collective events and having visions of the bloodbath of World War I, and also associating it to the loss of the hero archetype. And I must say that it's really only now, 75 years later, that it all begins to make sense to us. That what really began in 1912 was not the beginning of the modern age, but actually the beginning of the end of the modern age. And then in fact, the modern attitude, which had been gradually shaped over the 19th century, was founded on a hero motif, which was doomed to bite the dust in a prolonged outpouring of blood, of which World War I was just the first act, as Virginia Woolf realized when she wrote that last book, Between the Acts. and that we would have a World War II, and that we would have a Korean War, but that also it would be a long acting out of a dying of the hero as the dominant of our culture, and that we in fact have been moving all along toward what people are now calling the postmodern age, in which heroic consciousness is not the point. So that Jung was coming in right at the beginning with his psyche on perhaps the most important movement in the psyche since the medieval synthesis broke down in favor of the Renaissance idea of the dignity of man. In other words, with the dignity of man came the danger of heroic inflation and of too much emphasis upon the hero archetype. And that continued to build in various ways through all the centuries that followed, until finally it all began to break down, just at the point that depth psychology was being born. And the first attempt to make it work was on that old heroic model. Freud the hero with his self-analysis, and Jung the hero's son. And it was that Jung broke right at the beginning to start the psychology that still got us in its grip today, that we're still trying to learn today. Now, imagine being there then. It's so easy to talk about it after 75 years, but imagine being there then in 1912 and 1913 and throwing overboard the basic orienting principle that had been essentially guiding men like Jung, who were interested in consciousness and in appraising the human conditions. The very archetype that had, in effect, organized experience for men like Jung since Montaigne's day. Imagine throwing that out, because that's what he threw out when he threw out Siegfried. He was absolutely lost. He just had nary a clue as to how to proceed, and the tools that he had, which were these finely honed conceptual instruments, the words, the terms, the languages, the categories, all of those things, no longer seemed to be like laboratory tools that he could pick up and use at will to appraise people from outside. As he put it, it was as if in that laboratory the instruments were flying around the room, because he was discovering that all of these ideas are finally not his, but the psyche's. That the psyche can give them to us or yank them back at will. So here's a man in a very confused and disoriented inner space. As Gregory Bateson says, he was a man whose epistemology was confused, and when your epistemology is confused, you become psychotic. And indeed, the family had an invasion of ghosts in which everyone saw them. And Jung wrote the 7 Sermons of the Dead in the midst of that. And he was in a creative crisis. Until things quieted down, he certainly could not write again. so yes, it was said that there was a Zurich school, and some papers that Jung had written along the way of the break with Freud, before things started getting so hot internally, were published. And in English, the book that had been the occasion for the escalating bitterness, Symbols of Transformation, was published, and these papers on analytical psychology were published, so that it looked as if there was activity, particularly with English translations. But this was all work done before. The actual man was making mud pies in the backyard and going into the study with his active imaginations and seeing his patients, and rather estranged from a number of former professional colleagues, and in very bad shape indeed. And he was also in the midst of a major love crisis, because he had decided to accept a relationship with his former patient, Tony Wolfe. He had referred her to someone else after the end of some work with him, and she was still in love with him at the end of the work, and he hadn't seen her for several months, and he went through a lot of inner turmoil and a lot of soul-searching, and finally decided that he must have this relationship, and basically installed her in his life as a kind of second relationship with the full knowledge of his wife, Emma Jung, to the point that he would see Tony Wolfe on Wednesday afternoon, and she would come to dinner with the family on Sunday afternoon. And somehow all of this was going on at this time, and he had to sacrifice social level he had attained for a much more, some would say, putting it charitably, a much more bohemian arrangement, despite the way in which Emma Jung, with her remarkable qualities, kept this together. So it was a time in many, many ways of personality and social breakdown for Jung. And when he finally had worked on his fantasies enough to come to the psyche from inside and experience it this time as something he had less choice over, but something that insisted on expressing itself through him in just its particular way, with just its particular style, and had really accepted the reality of the psyche as something you don't fool around with or manipulate, but something that must be honored. Something that I suppose every one of you in this room knows now, but was in many ways a new attitude. Really approaching the psyche with a psychological attitude. When he had finally found that attitude toward the psyche which is appropriate to psyche, which Joseph Henderson is now calling the psychological attitude. It doesn't depend upon a kind of borrowed scientism, as if the psyche were something else that could be studied from outside, but in that alchemical way, washing the material in its own water. When Jung had learned to do this by building his psychology from his fantasies and had begun to come up for air, the first book that he wrote was the book Psychological Types. And he called it, in the English translation, Psychological Types, or the psychology of individuation. It was to this model that we're going to talk about all through this weekend that Jung turned to orient himself this time on a more authentic basis and to establish his new ego position, his new conscious position. And if you get nothing else out of this entire seminar, but the idea that psychological types has everything to do with finding one's own unique orientation when one has been sufficiently disoriented to need it, you'll have gotten the main point. It's from that point of view that I want to be talking about this with you. This is not a theory to be used glibly to classify people from outside. That misses the point. It is not a 19th century scientific theory based on heroic consciousness. It's probably the first postmodern psychological theory, and it's based on empathic participation in the life of the psyche through suffering through the process of trying to find one's own standpoint in the middle of an ever-shifting psychological ground that one cannot escape from. And it's not truly an heroic ego model from outside, but rather it is an archetype of orientation. What we're looking at in the system of psychological types, with its fourfoldness, its two axes, the thinking-feeling axis and the sensation-intuition axis. And we'll go over these again and again through the weekends. Sometimes the rational and the irrational axis, they're called, is a kind of simple mandala, a simple archetypal model organizing the possibilities of consciousness. Whenever you use a fourfold model, you know that you're confessing a kind of ignorance. In one of her seminars, von Franz talks about how the ancient map makers, before they knew for sure that the world was round in a geographic way, that no one had actually proved it by navigation, although the idea had been there long before Columbus, could only map out the world as far as they knew it to be. And when they reached the edges of the waters and didn't know what was beyond, they would put 4 angels blowing trumpets, representing the unknown thing, or perhaps they'd have an image of the 4 winds or something. Whenever you get to the edge of what you know, the 4 comes up to kind of take care of what you don't know. So Jung, dealing with this unknown thing, what is my psyche, what is my psychology, came up with this fourfold model. And immediately there's the confession that he doesn't really know what he's talking about, but he has to have some way of talking about it, so he uses this mandala, this fourfold differentiating model. So we're dealing with an archetype for what? Not simply the psyche. I think that's a little vague. I think particularly the archetype of the differentiation of consciousness. The point is that if consciousness is going to differentiate, if we're going to get beyond simple identification, and so few of us do really, if we're not simply going to be, as Jung said, most people go to their graves, infants. Or as Joseph Henderson said, most people live their complexes as if they were reality. If one is not simply going to be one's mother's daughter or one's father's son or somebody's child, if we're going to break these, or someone's husband or someone's wife or someone's lover or whatever, if we're going to break these identifications and we're going to be ourselves, and we are going to be that trembling special thing which is consciousness, if we take that journey at all, Jung is saying, by publishing this book at this time, this psychological type's mandala is the archetype that he thinks will be our guide for the differentiation of our consciousness. Now, what does consciousness mean in the Jungian sense? It isn't simply non-comatose, although that does help. Late in his life, Jung was asked in Zurich by some institute students, does consciousness help in the process of individuation? And of course this was a sincerely asked question, because there is this idea that individuation is an entirely natural process. On the other hand, there's the question of, can analysis enhance individuation, and what are the role of the analyst's interpretations and reading and education and people being made aware of things and so forth. So Jung was asked, does consciousness help in the process of individuation? And Jung's answer was, consciousness is the human being's individuation. He said, if a plant has it in its rhizome to produce a certain flower, and the plant flowers, you can speak of the flower as the individuation of the plant. And he said, consciousness is the human being's flower. And with the book Psychological Types, he's telling us that if we're lucky enough to produce the flower, if, as Dylan Thomas says, the force that through the green fuse drives happens to drive us to produce the flower, our flower will differentiate according to this fourfold model. So, someone like me, or any of you listening, hearing it, can really only talk about this model in terms of his own individuation. In other words, I can only tell you about this as a sequence of my discoveries of how the different functions came alive in me and where they seem to fit within my own psychology. And I found it helpful to go back to that early Jung who worked with complex theory, and before he had his creative breakdown, and see that there was all along a subtle connection between the types and the various complexes that come up as one goes through a deep searching analytic individuation process. Jung noticed right at the beginning, in that first grasp, that there was a there in the unconscious, that some important process was interfering with the association test, certain peculiarities of response. And that it wasn't enough simply to say that there were complexes interfering with the test, but that there was something else, because some people seemed to take to the test itself in a particular style and other people went at it in another style. He noticed that some people had to relate themselves to the words on the test and establish some kind of feeling connection to them before they could do the test at all, whereas other people could stay back coolly and simply handle the words as they came up. And he really was so much more at that time like the latter group of people that he really couldn't understand the former. So he called them in that very early 1904, 1905 period, he called those people the subjectively evaluating value predicative type. Meaning that these are people who had to predicate a value in the experience at all before they could relate to it. That's where he was then with the feeling type. And the other kind of person who could stay out of it all and just look at it objectively, that was the thinking type. For him, that was the objective type at that point. And at first, he thought that this was all there was, and he tried to cram all of typology into this, so that not only were these the feeling and thinking types, but they also were the introverts and the extroverts, and what we now call logos and eros was shoved into that, so that there was this initial compounding and conflation of all the concepts of typology until the Big Bang, when it all came loose a little bit and we could see what was actually in the universe. And he tried, even as a psychoanalyst, to talk about the fact that analysts really ought to take into account the fact that not everyone can be analyzed in the same way, because there are regular temperamental differences. And by then he knew about William James' tender-minded versus tough-minded, and he liked William James, and he met William James when he and Freud visited Clark University, and in 1909, and so he said, we really ought to realize that there are two groups of people, the introverts and the extroverts. And he was going to present this at the Munich Psychoanalytic Congress, and he was talking about the planning for this and talking about types, and Freud fainted. Jung had to carry Freud to a couch. So right at the beginning, you see, talking about types touches complexes. It's a powerhouse of a subject. And I myself have had my violent resistances to the way Jung laid it out at the beginning. Because unfortunately the first thing everyone got hold of was this distinction between introvert and extrovert, as if these were things in themselves, and that there really are two classes of people, the introverts and the extroverts. And this kind of Jung from before the individuation journey has somehow clung on like a cloud to confuse things for us. As I talk to you about introvert and extrovert, for the most part, I'm going to confine myself to using these as adjectives, introverted and extroverted. Adjectives to modify the four functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, which I think are far more central and far more important. Moreover, I'm not going to try so quickly to say of people that someone is an introvert or someone is an extrovert, because I found right at the beginning of my own journey, and well along into it that I was practically a Jungian analyst myself, and I still couldn't decide if I was an introvert or an extrovert, because it was so clear that under certain circumstances I was introverted, and other circumstances I was extroverted. And that indeed half my friends were absolutely convinced that I was introverted. In fact, I had some friends in psychiatric residency who were reading Jung and felt that I was the only person they knew who was introverted. Whereas I had an equal number of others, including myself, who was largely convinced that my nature was extroverted. The reason for this was that people who were responding to my thinking and to the way that I go into my own mind to make up my own words and my own names for things, and go inside into an interior place to kind of check that these words really fit a kind of subjective experience that I have, are experiencing the introversion of my thinking. But that those who have had the experience of having me practically read their mind as I'm talking and say something that they were just thinking, or use an example that had just passed through their mind, and have experienced me rather merging with their experience in an almost uncanny way, are just as convinced of my extroversion, because they're feeling the extroversion of my intuitive function, which does not go inside, but very much goes outside to merge. Now, one of Jung's early associates was Beatrice Hinkle, who translated Symbols of Transformation when it was still called The Psychology of the Unconscious back in 1916. And before the book on psychological types had been published, she herself published her own book called The Recreating of the Individual. And I have a dear friend named Nancy Hale, a writer and fiction and novels, who's had an analysis with Beatrice Hinkle in the 1940s and has been someone that I've talked to about my involvement in Jungian things, who learned Beatrice Hinkle's system of classification, in which Beatrice Hinkle talked about emotional introverts and subjective extroverts. And Nancy Hale helped solve my problem for me by explaining to me that I was a subjective extrovert with lots of introspection. So you can see that there are many ways to this. I think we have to completely rethink introversion and extraversion before we go a step further, because if we don't, you'll all, I think, rather quickly get lost. Certainly shy and gregarious don't make it, because I've met some extremely ebullient people who seem to have a superior introverted function, and I've met some very quiet people who have a superior extroverted function. When we have to talk at all about whether one is predominantly one or the other, let's remember that we're only talking about the function that comes first. I would call it function number one, the so-called superior function. The function that we feel superior about, among other things, if we're lucky enough to have found it. Remember that most people are not very well differentiated. And for many people, the psychological nature is as yet unborn. But if one is in the process of being born, and one is far enough along to have broken the first identification and undone the pact with the devil that we all sign when we're children. You know, the reason that for the Faust mythology is so popular, as a colleague of mine says, is that we've all sold out. We are all born into a family with a typological bias, and we're all born to a culture that has a psychological bias. And we learn very early that if we don't play ball typologically and play the type game that goes in our family and in our particular culture, we're not going to have the Faustian goodies of beauty, money, and power. And so for beauty, money, and power, we sell out, most of us, unless we're extremely lucky to be born into a family with a good type fit. We sell out our birthright, our natural, innate typology, and go along with the type program of the particular family we're in. And we pay, some of us, an enormous price for that. In a patriarchal culture, this common human fact becomes desperate for half the citizens, the women, because one is not merely conforming to type expectations, but also to gender expectations. So that the woman's own ego, the woman's own superior function, is quite unwelcome, and the woman's own natural unfolding mandala is going to be unwelcome because it's going to be feminine. And there's going to be an enormous payoff for the woman if she will play ball and adapt through her animus. So that I found often in these lectures that women become irritated and finally very angry, and because there's a frustration, because the animus, which is such a great female impersonator, has often differentiated a fourfold typology out of thin air, so to speak, which is quite capable of taking the type test and of listening to the psychological lecture and of creating an entire pseudo-personality that has next to nothing to do with the woman's own being and natural typology. So it's only if a woman has come so far that she's actually able to chuck all that animus adaptation and that false ego adaptation, that animus ego, and has begun to differentiate her own nature, that she can then begin to use this fourfold model in a truly feminine way to make sense of it. I think enough work has been done in the last 15 years particularly, that enough women are coming forward with their own minds and their own voices and their own hearts and their own points of view, that this will also make sense for women, provided one is really talking about the real nature. But remember how easy it is to be captured by that animus. And I'm aware that I'm a male giving the presentation, and I'm aware how much that can really catch the animus and the wish to comply and all the rest. And don't comply, be stubborn, resist. You will anyway, but befriend your resistance and try to make this your own, and try to see where you come in. And in a country like America, where this country is dedicated to the principle that all men are created equal, where extroverted thinking is the way, thinking for everybody that somehow leaves out everybody else. The situation isn't so very different for a man whose superior function really is, or is innately meant to be, or is going to be introverted feeling, because there's so much payoff for him in showing that he can think, that his adaptation is so frequently going to come through the anima, which for him, for this introverted feeling man, carries extroverted thinking. So that with subtle signs of anima strain, and the anima can be a great male impersonator, but occasionally the whine in the voice gives away the strain on the anima, or a certain touchiness or a bit of passive-aggressive irritability, just a touch of strain, shows that this man who thinks so well and knows the names for everything and is so careful with the macho trip of the extroverted thinking is really using his inferior function to mount a personality and not daring to claim the introverted feeling that would make him a sissy in a world in which blue, the thinking color, is for boys, and red, the feeling color, but not even red. Pink is for girls, and not even women, but girls. Yes. So, not everyone is lucky enough to have a superior function that they use and know about. Not everyone has even square one filled in yet. And it doesn't seem to work to have someone fill it in for you. It doesn't seem to work to be told what type you are unless a certain amount of inner work has already taken place. It seems that what we all have to do is, so to speak, drop anchor. We have to establish what Edward Edinger calls an ego-self axis for ourselves before we can know enough of who we are. And to do that, one has to establish, so to speak, one's spine. I like to think of the types in a bodily way. And if I stand here, I'd like you to just think of the head, and then there's a spine that leads down to the tailbone. And for each of us, establishing this axis seems to me to be the important first step in type. This axis is a kind of plumb line between what we're best at and what we're worst at, and they seem to be wonderfully related to each other. I learned very early on that I was very good at reading people's minds. I found when I was 3 and 4 years old that I would say things that would absolutely astound my mother because I would know things I couldn't possibly know. One day she was looking out the window from an apartment we had in Baltimore down several stories, and a little girl was that we knew named Sally was sitting and squatting on the street to go potty, and my mother was thinking to herself how awful this was, and I sitting at her feet well under the window and completely unable to see out it, said, "Bad Sally," and so forth. And my mother rather liked this in me. She thought this was kind of wonderful. On the other hand, she didn't like it at all that I was constantly losing things. She used to say, you lose things. One could follow where you've been through the city by seeing the trail of the coins and keys and watches that you leave behind you. So I learned rather early on that I had a rather remarkable intuitive gift, and that I was equally horrendous in the area of sensation. And it seemed always to be very clear to me that there was some natural relation, that these were sort of ends of a continuum. I know some people like to separate these things up, but it's never seemed to me that I could ever separate these things about myself. So this is one of Jung's psychological ideas that's never given me any trouble whatsoever. It seemed almost self-evident to me that what I'm best at and what I'm worst at. So my spine is an intuitive head with a sensation tail. And I've come to realize over years that it's an extroverted intuitive and an introverted sensation. And I must say that for the longest time, I felt the inferiority much more than I felt the superiority, because aside from my mother, the world in which I grew up didn't have very much room for an extroverted, intuitive boy. With a thinking type father, it seemed very important that I learn to think. And my father being an extroverted thinking type, I learned very much according to extroverted thinking standards. My father was a man who had his IQ published in the Wichita, Kansas newspaper when he was a boy, and it was, I think, the second highest IQ in the city, and so he had a mother who taught Greek and Latin and academic achievement and learning things. And the language was placed very high, and so I became, in accord with this, a kind of good extroverted thinker for a long period of my life, so that I became a kind of a superstar in junior high and high school, sufficiently enough to get a scholarship to Harvard, that temple of extroverted thinking, and with the high suicide rate because of the damaged introverted feeling, and learned very much to say what one ought to say.
This podcast is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Share it all you like as long as you maintain the attribution to the speaker, but please do not change it or sell it. If you like this episode, tell your friends about us or leave us a review on iTunes. For more information about classes, training programs, videos, audio, this podcast, or to find a Jungian analyst near you, visit our website, www.jungchicago.org.